Now we shall see the correspondence of a relation with the entity relationship diagram. So a relation simply corresponds with the entity types. इस वक्त के बाद अगर मैं टेबल का वर्ड यूज करूंगा तो उसका मतलब रिलेशन ही होगा, ठीक है, इट शुड बी अंडरस्टूड, बिकॉज टेबल की डेटाबेस सिस्टम के अंदर कोई गुंजाइश नहीं है. सो इफ आई यूज द वर्ड टेबल दैट वुड मीन अ रिलेशन, ओके, विद ऑल दोज 6 characteristics that we have just learned. So all of the entity types, they correspond with a relation. So all of them, we shall convert all of those identified entity types into relations, okay? And these rows, they basically represent the entity instances, okay? Although we did not model entity instances in the entity relationship diagram, rather we modeled the entity types and the relationship types, but those entity types and relationship types, they were modeled with the help of entity and relationship instances. Although there is no representation of entity and relationship instances in the entity relationship or the enhanced entity relationship diagram, but when this relational structure is created, we'll also take help from those samples which are finally going to be added into the database. So whenever data is added into the database, one row basically represents one entity instance, okay? So for example, this row is representing one student. Similarly, this row 2 is representation of one student, okay? Are you following me? Great. Columns of this relation, they simply correspond with the attributes of the entities and the relationships as well, because we discussed that a relationship can also have attributes. So the attributes which were detected in the entity relationship and the enhanced entity relationship diagram, those attributes are represented here in the relational model in form of the columns of a relation, okay? Now, 2 new concepts we are going to discuss these. One of the concept has been discussed, which is the concept of a primary key. If you remember, we discussed a classification of attributes, which was identifiers and non-identifiers. Do you remember that? Identifier attributes were attributes whose values can be used in order to uniquely identify instance of an entity. Okay, I shared the example of registration number and the CNIC and social security number. All of these columns, their values can be used to uniquely identify an instance. इसका मतलब यह है कि if I query on a particular registration number, I'll get exactly one or no result. There is no possibility कि मैं एक से ज्यादा results मुझे कभी मिले, because there is no possibility of duplication in an identifier. This is a requirement. Another requirement was that an identifier always has a value. Null value is not permitted in an identifier. Another thing was that an identifier value is never changed, that is never edited, okay? So all these characteristics are characteristics of identifier attributes, so that we can use their values in order to uniquely identify the instances of an entity type, okay? And all of the other attributes, they are non-identifier attributes. We also discussed that among the identified identifiers in an entity type, the best one is selected, and that best one is declared as the proper regular key of that entity, okay? And that selected key is then used to uniquely identify the instances. We can say officially, right? So that is officially declared, that is regularly declared, that the best identifier is declared the key for an entity. And when we convert that entity relationship diagram into the relational model, that key is referred to as the primary key. Okay, all of the identifiers, they were candidate keys, and the selected key is the primary key of a particular relation. So in a relation where there are other columns, there would be a column which would be tagged as the primary key of that relation, which would mean that the value of that primary key would be used to uniquely identify an instance of that particular entity type. Number one. Number two, there is another concept, and that concept is concept of a foreign key. A foreign key is an additional column which is created in a relation to hold the relationship. Okay, so if there is a relationship that has been identified in the entity relationship diagram between some entities, for example, in the entity relationship diagram, we had student and we had the ID card, okay? And there was a relationship between these two. Now this student, this would be converted into a relation, as I told you, okay? Its name would be student. All of the attributes which were there, they would be converted into the columns. For example, there was ID, there was, for example, name, and there was cell number, for example. Okay, so for example, there were 3 attributes. And in the ID card, for example, there were 2 attributes. One was CID to represent the card's ID, and another was, for example, RFID number. Okay, so for example, there were these 2 attributes in the ID card's entity. Okay, so for example, we have declared this CID as the primary key for this ID card relation, and this ID is, for example, the primary key of the student's relation. Now in the relational structure, we have to transform this relationship in this structure as well. So in order to convert the relationship identified in the entity relationship diagram, we can have a primary key represented in this relation as a foreign key, or we can have a foreign key in this relation in order to refer to a primary key. So we can use primary key of one of the participating relations. Okay, we use primary key of one of the participating relations and we create an additional column in the other relation. Okay, फोकस करें मेरी बात के ऊपर, मैं रिपीट कर देता हूं. हमारे पास जब 2 रिलेशंस हैं जिनके दरमियान रिलेशनशिप है, ठीक है, उस रिलेशनशिप को रिप्रेजेंट करने के लिए हमें किसी एक की प्राइमरी की को एक से दूसरे के अंदर कह सकते हैं एक्सपोर्ट करना पड़ेगा. एक्सपोर्ट का वर्ड शायद मुनासिब नहीं है, उसके हमें लिंक करना पड़ेगा, उसके लिए हमें एक कॉलम एडिशनल क्रिएट करना पड़ेगा. सो वी नीड टू क्रिएट एन एडिशनल कॉलम in one of the relations, and it depends, there are some rules, it depends on the cardinalities कि कौन सा प्राइमरी की किसके अंदर फॉरेन की बनेगा. that depends on the cardinalities that we shall learn in the later part of this lecture. but यहां पे आप याद रखो कि we have to create an additional column in one of the relations, and that additional column is referred to as foreign key. now we have, for example, as per rules, a new column has been added in the student's relation, for example, and its name can be any name, but that should be similar to this name. You can have same names, but that should be meaningful. For example, हम यहाँ पे भी इसको card ID कहते हैं. This is represented with the help of a dashed underline. A dashed underline in the relational model represents a foreign key. Now this is a foreign key. This additional column that has been created in this relation, this is the foreign key, and this foreign key, every foreign key has to refer to a primary key. Now this foreign key refers to this primary key. This is represented with the help of an arrow. This arrow means that this foreign key is referencing this primary key. So we have to create an additional column in order to represent the presence of a primary key in another relation as a foreign key, number one. Number two, the common values. If there are two similar values in foreign and primary key, so if there is a value in the foreign key which has a match with a value in the primary key, okay, so for example, there is a value in the foreign key that is similar to a value in the primary key, that would mean that these two instances have that relationship instance. For example, there is a student whose ID is 1, name is XYZ, and has a cell number, okay? And for example, here we have a card with a card ID 1 and there is a number. For example, if one value is placed in this cell, now because this value is similar to a value in the primary key, because this value matches with the value in the primary key, it means that this row has a relationship instance with this row. Are you getting my point? Similarly, for example, there is another card. ये यहाँ पे रिपीटिशन नहीं हो सकती, ठीक है, यहाँ पे रिपीटिशन नहीं हो सकती क्योंकि प्राइमरी की है. फॉर एग्जांपल, देयर इज अनदर स्टूडेंट whose name is MNO and he has got a cell number, and for example there is a value 1, for example here. Now this one, because has a match in the primary key, so it means that this row is also connected to this row. It means that this row has a relationship instance with this row. So both these rows, they have relationship instances with this row. So common values, the matching values in the primary and the foreign key basically maintains the relationship instance. And representation of a primary key in another relation maintains the relationship type. So if we create a foreign key in a relation and if we connect that foreign key with another relation's primary key, it would represent the relationship type between those two relations. Okay, so in relational model, the relationships, they are accommodated with the help of a foreign and a primary key. Now whenever this is done, whenever a foreign key is created in a relation and basically that foreign key references to a primary key, the relation whose primary key is represented, that is referred to as the parent relation for this particular relationship. Okay, so whenever a foreign key is created in a relation to reference to a foreign key, so whose primary key is referenced, that relation is referred to as the parent relation in that particular relationship. So in this particular example, ID card is the parent relation, and the relation in which that foreign key is created, that is referred to as dependent relation, not the child relation, sorry. Okay, so that is referred to as dependent relation. So this is a parent dependent relationship. Okay,